afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next panel session. It is the Biodiversity Risk and the Nature Positive Transition panel, and your moderator for this session is going to be Nina Seega, who's a director at the Centre for Sustainable Finance at Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and she's going to introduce your panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody here. It's my pleasure to be speaking about nature and about biodiversity at the Finance Forum today. Ooh, some lovely music coming through as well, so we're going to have a little bit of a party by the sounds of it. The way we're going to do this is I'll do a little bit of an introduction, then I will introduce our absolutely fantastic panel, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you can start posting those questions onto the Slido so that we have an involved conversation, and there is the QR code on the screen for that. So I've been leading the Centre for Sustainable Finance at CISL for a while, and we've been doing a lot of work on financial materiality of nature. And essentially we started with relatively basic concepts and went then into a framework on nature-related financial risks and how do you actually start thinking about bringing nature into mainstream financial conversation. And a couple of years ago, we started also working with our investment managers through our investment leaders group, with our banks through our Banking Environment Initiative, and with our insurance through ClimateWise on use cases. And we've done use cases on how the loss of ecosystem services presents mainstream financial risk. So we've done stuff with HSBC on their portfolio of heavy industry clients in Southeast Asia, and how water stress can present quite a substantial risk, bringing the credit rating of some of the companies in that portfolio from investment grade to sub-investment grade to junk. We've also done work on how land degradation can cause the loss of value across the entire value chain. And we're going to be publishing use cases in June around insurance and how insurance can enable nature positive financing and nature-based solutions. But I've got an amazing panel who will tell you all about how biodiversity risk is actually coming through. So let me introduce them. We've got Karen Ellis, who's the Chief Economist at the WWF. We've got Daniel Zarin, who's an Executive Director at the Wildlife Conservation Society, and Rob Wreglesworth, who is an Innovation Lead at the Environment Bank. So if we jump right in, and I start with a question to Rob. I mean, one of the things that we hear a lot of the time when we speak to financial institutions, when we speak to corporates, is that nature and biodiversity is so complex, it's so difficult, how might we even get into it? So when you hear that challenge, how do you deal with that challenge? And how do you ensure that that challenge doesn't actually stop nature positive action?
Thank you very much. Great question. So yeah, I'm an ecologist by training, and it's kind of, I'm getting a bit of imposter syndrome being in a finance forum and talking to the finance world, but it's where we need to be, really. It's where we needed to be for a long time, and I spent a lot of time going to conferences with other ecologists, talking about biodiversity decline and showing the same slides over and over again to everyone about how biodiversity is continuing to decline around the world. And we'd go back the next year and we'd see that the slide is still the same and biodiversity is still declining around the world. And we never really could understand why people weren't paying for this and why there was a lack of finance coming into the sector. And the fact is that we've been measuring biodiversity for a long time. We've got really good ways of measuring biodiversity, of measuring nature. In those conferences, we were discussing this. We were going through studies that were being done that were showing that nature was declining and that new technology was coming in to measure it and to show how it was doing so, but we weren't connecting the dots. So I would say that although we don't have one unit for biodiversity as we do for carbon, a ton of carbon, which does make it slightly more complicated and slightly harder to communicate to people that aren't ecologists, who aren't working in this space, we do have a lot of really good metrics and a lot of really good science that's been going on for decades. On top of that, there's new innovation happening all the time. It's really good to be at an innovation conference, and I work in innovation as well. And in the biodiversity space, there's new technologies coming through literally every week, pretty much, it feels at the moment, which are going to help us monitor and measure biodiversity in new and innovative and cost-effective ways. So I think the key thing here that I always try and stress, and it's stealing a quote from a colleague of mine, but it's effectively to say that when we talk about biodiversity, we're not measuring up for an arc. It's too easy to think that with biodiversity, with nature, we need to count every single species out there, every single species on the planet, to get an idea of what's happening with biodiversity. And we're guilty of that as ecologists as well, of trying to count everything, of fighting amongst ourselves, saying that birds are more important or bats are more important or something like that. But the reality is we're not trying to measure everything. We're trying to find key indicators within ecosystems that can tell us the story of what's going on. And that helps us do things in a more cost-effective way and stops us from getting paralyzed by this idea that biodiversity is hard to measure. It's complex, there's variety, it's what makes biodiversity in nature so amazing. But the idea that we can't measure it is really just an excuse for inaction, I think.
And actually, it's quite an interesting point because so my background is in finance, and I spend a lot of the time on the trading floor through the financial crisis doing things like CDO squareds or CPDOs. And if finance can deal with that, surely we can figure out how to bring biodiversity and nature into our economic systems, into our day-to-day conversation. And that actually brings me to a question to Karen. So there is this disconnect between nature on one side and our economic system on the other side, and some of it is driven by the way we measure our progress, by GDP, by kind of what actually matters in economic and financial decision making. So can you talk us through how integrating biodiversity into economic decisions can lead to a more sustainable way forward?
Yeah, thank you very much. Great question. I mean, we know the economy is heavily dependent on nature. OECD estimated the value of ecosystem services that nature provides at $125 trillion, which is very big. And we know that S&P, for example, estimated that 85% of the firms in their index are directly dependent on nature. But also, of course, 100% of firms are indirectly dependent on nature and the ecosystem services it provides for their business success. And yet we are destroying nature at quite a fast rate, and it's not slowing down at the moment. And that is posing ever-growing costs. And so we had just last week the report coming out from the Green Finance Institute, which for the first time estimated the impact on the UK economy of nature loss and showed that it could be up to 12% of GDP within a few years, which is a staggering figure, terrifying figure really, because that's bigger than the COVID and bigger than the financial crisis. So these costs are very significant and they're systemic. And yet we're not doing enough to tackle that. As Nina said, it's not embedded in decision making. We're beginning to do that now. So there is, for example, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is getting companies for the first time to think about their nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And that should hopefully lead to a better understanding of how they can manage those risks and impacts. But at the moment, there's no real expectation or requirement for them to actually factor in the externalities associated with nature that don't necessarily directly impact them. And policy isn't really doing that much either. So we have been arguing that we need a sort of nature-positive transition, just like the net zero transition. So there's lots of discussion of a net zero transition where we move away from, climate-causing technologies. We need the same thing for nature. So we move away from nature-damaging technologies and modes of production towards nature-friendly production processes, technologies, etc. And that creates all sorts of opportunities to invest in more nature-friendly technologies and innovations, etc. So it's easier to invest in the nature-positive transition than in nature itself. It's hard to invest in nature itself in a way that generates a financial rate of return a lot of the time because the policy framework isn't yet valuing nature. But there is an opportunity to invest in nature-friendly business models, and that's what we'd like to see incentivized. Both, of course, we want to see incentivized, but we believe there's a scope for a net zero and nature-positive transition. Companies required to produce transition plans covering both of those issues in an integrated way, and then incentives put in place by government to support the delivery of those transition plans by companies. So we think this is a really exciting opportunity. We're on the cusp of it at the moment. It hasn't quite come to fruition, but a lot in the private sector, I think, are seeing that opportunity now.
And if I maybe elaborate on that a little bit, I mean, we've already seen things like debt for nature swaps and the insurance companies stepping in to enable that. So I think we're starting to see the market move where you are looking at the ecosystem services that nature provide in building up resilience, in creating more adaptation, and finding ways to create cash flows out of them, and therefore using that to invest in them. So I think there's quite a bit to unpack here. But just kind of coming to your regulatory point and policy point, I've got a question for Daniel in terms of, when we look at what policy support we need, what kind of legislative or incentive-based measures can governments implement to encourage action on the local scale as well as on the global scale?
Thanks, Nina. It's a very big question, and I'm sure I won't address it comprehensively. I'll try to illustrate some main trends. First, let me just say my role within WCS, which is a global conservation organization, is to lead a forests and climate change program. And so these issues of this intersection between biodiversity and climate and risk and financing are the bread and butter for how I'm working in the context of trying to affect both policy but also implement things on the ground on a day-to-day basis. I want to sort of pick up on a comment that Karen made, because I think it's quite profound, that the risk faced from nature loss is bigger than the economic risk associated with COVID, right? In response to the COVID crisis, governments invested, particularly in the global north, trillions of dollars to address the challenges. We see nothing on that scale happening yet in this space. And so I would encourage us, given that the comparability of risk, to be thinking about that as the ambition of the direction of travel that we need to be headed in. Now, to address your question here, I think it's there are really quite distinct sets of instruments or categories of instruments at national and subnational levels versus at international level. And national and subnational governments have, one could say, a bit of an advantage because they have these command and control instruments, which are almost entirely lacking at the international level, although there are some quite strong incentives present internationally. So but in both levels, there are certainly area-based instruments and modalities to focus on. At the international level, we have this 30 by 30 pledge ambition coming out of the Global Biodiversity Framework. But much of the real work has to do with designating areas for their protection at national and subnational level, particularly in the areas where biodiversity is most important in the global south. So take an example like Brazil, where you have tens of millions of undesignated hectares of public land in the Amazon basin. In the DRC, no one's quite sure of the number, but it's more like 100 million hectares of undesignated public land that is ripe for speculation and exploitation in the absence of designating that land, either for some kind of formal protected status or in many instances as indigenous territory. And we have very strong evidence that indigenous peoples provide a core role in terms of their stewardship of nature and of biodiversity, which is quite dismally under-financed. So that's one area, and perhaps the more important, if we take a perspective of using a kind of mitigation or conservation hierarchy and prioritizing the need to protect what remains of intact or high integrity natural ecosystems. We have other instruments, right, at national and subnational level. There are incentive-based instruments, usually often through tax policies, to incentivize the protection of nature or the restoration of nature. There's a lot going on in the UK, which obviously I'm a New Yorker, you can tell by my accent, I will not speak to. But there are also in many countries what you might call impact-based instruments that require, that in the first instance prohibit negative impacts on ecosystems, or in other instances require compensation, whether it's financial compensation going into supporting protected areas or financial compensation going into restoration of biodiversity, restoration of nature in a number of countries. Internationally, we have these similar instruments, area-based, I mentioned, but without the teeth of command and control. Similarly, these incentive-based systems, there was a panel earlier today on biodiversity credits, which are actually separate at least into different categories in the voluntary space, some associated with the stewardship of nature and others with what's now called uplift of biodiversity. Two different things, probably not exactly the same instrument to incentivize them, but those are quite emergent. And we're all aware that in the carbon space, which is closely connected to this, that there are markets, voluntary market, an emergent compliance market. Those are fragile, have their own challenges associated with them, but they're already there, and we have a much longer discussion about that. What's often overlooked in the international space, though, that is probably among the quite strong instruments, are trade-based instruments. We have the UK, you have the VPA. The US has a much longer history with the Lacey Act in prohibiting the importation of endangered species. The EU now has a deforestation regulation associated with trade. There are many others in the trade space, and those actually have teeth, and there is measurable impact associated with them. And then finally, as Nina was mentioning, there are debt-based instruments, debt for nature swaps, other forms of green bonds that are growing in their use. There's a half a dozen countries either that in the past few years have undertaken debt for nature swaps or other forms of biodiversity-related green bonds, often in the marine area, which is a very important and relatively new development, but also terrestrially. So that's a kind of a quick survey. I'm sure I've left some things out, but gives a kind of overview of that space. Thank you.
And if I add on the financial regulation space, which is one of my favorite spaces to play in, there is a network for greening the financial system, which has recently, I think this autumn, issued a conceptual framework for how financial supervisors, financial regulators, banks, central banks, prudential regulators can start thinking about bringing in nature and biodiversity into their regulatory frameworks and start thinking about the connection between nature loss and financial stability. And that opens the door to prudential regulation to come in on a bilateral basis. And we've seen, for example, Switzerland moving to get financial institutions to start reporting on nature-related risk, and we've seen the first law in France. A bit of a maybe a round robin. So we've spoken a lot about where we're coming from, but if you were to pick out of your huge amount of experience in working in this space, kind of one thing, it can be an innovation, a process, a solution that fosters good nature-related financial risk management, what would it be? So if we start with Rob, sorry.
Yeah, good question. I mean, we at Environment Bank, where I work, we've been working in the biodiversity net gain space in the UK for a long time now, since the idea was come up with sort of 10 years ago until it's been put into policy now. And I think what I'm really interested in is this question between balancing risk and that opportunity side of things, and that message of doing things for the right reason in the voluntary space, and then where we can use legislation and policy to push things forward at the kind of pace that we need. And so what we've seen, and someone working in ecology for a long time and telling, so for anyone that doesn't know, biodiversity net gain policy is requiring now all developers in the UK to provide a 10% gain for biodiversity as part of their planning applications. And if they can't mitigate it and avoid it, they have to compensate for it elsewhere. And for years and years, we were telling developers to do things for the right reasons, to save nature because it's the right thing to do, and there's good PR reasons to do it, but it wasn't really shifting the needle quickly enough. And what we found through just the very idea of the legislation coming in a few years ago was the real increase in action happening pretty much straight away. So the forward-thinking developers who saw this coming down the line got moving and started bringing in biodiversity experts, bringing in nature experts to their team to start upskilling there, because they saw it as a risk to them potentially in the future. So they were mitigating that risk of the legislation coming in by upskilling then. And then what we're seeing now is a kind of a market emerging of projects on the compensation side of really high integrity projects that can facilitate the requirement for the compensation and the offsetting when the impacts can't be mitigated. So yeah, that's the first-hand example, I guess, I've got of where the potential risk of non-compliance has driven a market. So that's probably the best case I've got to talk about. Yeah.
Fantastic. Karen?
So Could I have two? Very brief and linked. So one is around transition plans. So there's been lots of discussion here about transition plans today and yesterday, particularly climate transition plans, which are being mandated by the UK government and the EU, and which are really unlocking creativity in the private sector to think about how can they meet their climate goals, how can they manage climate risks. We've been arguing as part of the Transition Plan Task Force that they should include nature as well, because nature is a big contributor to tackling climate change, and we will never achieve net zero without tackling nature loss. So including nature in your transition plans is one key step, and we've published a paper on nature in transition plans which gives lots of guidance about how to do that, where other sources of information and tools are for different types of nature-related goals. But at the same time, we are aware that there's still a lot of definition required for the nature-positive transition, so we're not sure yet, really, in some sectors of the economy, what a nature-positive sector would look like. In the same way as we've got, for net zero, we've got sectoral pathways mapped out for all the key sectors of the economy: energy, manufacturing, transport. And so that sector knows what it's got to do to align itself with net zero. We haven't got that for a nature-positive goal at the moment. So we've also been arguing that we need nature-positive sectoral pathways mapped out that actually set a sort of timeline and a pathway towards that sector's contribution to achieving environmental goals, such as those agreed in the Global Biodiversity Framework, the CBD COP, which all countries have signed up to, and which does have a set of targets. So how can the private sector contribute to that? And the CBD does say the private sector should be aligned with that. How can it do so? We need those nature-positive sectoral pathways to really show what that transition will look like, and then the private sector can align with it. And that also points towards the kinds of investments and innovations that will be needed, and really unlocks that investment dynamic as well that we were talking about earlier, that we really want to see, that, you know, profit-making potential to actually deliver nature-positive outcomes in a way that also is good for business.
And if I'll be cheeky on that side as well, because you were doing too, but this climate-nature connection, I 100% agree with you. So what we started doing from last year was every time we talk about climate with our organizations, we bring nature into that conversation. So we have climate engagement guides for bank relationship managers and investment managers and asset owners. So we brought in nature into that, saying, if you are engaging with your clients, this is how you can start asking questions around nature. So if you tackle those two things in one go, it brings a lot of benefits to it. Coming to you.
Great. I'm going to take a note from Karen and also do two
You're
that
gonna
are
go
related.
three.
No, just two. Three would be too much. But look, I think starting from the premise, which sounds like we all share on the panel, that's hard to read an audience, but the premise from starting from is that our economies, and all of our economies, are free riders on the ecosystem services that nature provides. Now, the tricky thing is that, honestly, that's always been true, right? But the difference now is that we have so stressed what we might refer to as the natural infrastructure that helps to, that conserve biodiversity, that helps to regulate climate, right, that it's eroding. And it's eroding everywhere. And if we don't actually put value on it, then its value is equal to zero, and it will continue to erode. And you know, our analyses show that, for instance, you know, if you take away the forests that are the best remaining forests in the world, we'd be at least half a degree hotter than we are now, right? At a cost of trillions of dollars to the global economy. But that value in the marketplace is zero at the moment. That's a huge market failure. Right? And so the overall question here is, how do we begin to address the market failure? And we see progress in that direction, but not nearly fast enough. Okay, so the two examples that I have are, one is quite site level and project level, and the other more global. At the project level is something that my team and I have been working on for the past couple of years, is to stand up essentially a new asset class focused on high integrity tropical forests, right? These are quite critical ecosystems. Integrity, we have a numeric metric for, we have a good index for it. And we're working at a number of different sites, piloting them already with government agreements in the Amazon and in the Congo, to develop these sites that are, well, one of them is ready to transact. We're hoping to transact it later this year. I'm not allowed to say with who or anything, but hopefully we'll get there. That will, in the Amazon, be about 3.5 million hectares of land And over the data that we have around carbon is, over a decade, about 60 million tons of CO2 removals. This is not emission reductions. So if we can bring value to conserving that first part of the mitigation hierarchy, protecting areas that are in good shape. It's like preventive healthcare. It's not sexy, but it's really cost effective, and we need it, right? We've already got mechanisms for urgent care around avoiding deforestation and for restorative care around restoration. But this prevention space is right now empty. Okay, so we have an instrument, happy to talk to folks afterwards about it. We're quite transparent about all of the details. At the larger scale, that some of you may have heard of, there's a very interesting innovation concept that the government of Brazil introduced to the world in Dubai at the end of last year, which is the concept of a tropical forests forever fund. They are working now to make this not a Brazilian concept, but a concept of a set of tropical forest governments with support from some global north governments, from some sovereign funds and others. The idea is to pull together a fund that would be on the order of $250 billion that would have the purpose of compensating the conservation of tropical forests in countries that are doing that. They would be on an area basis with a huge discount for deforestation and potentially degradation. But if this idea moves forward, and you will hear more about this at the CBD COP in Cali, and next year the aim to launch at the Climate COP in Brazil, that's a global instrument that could have an enormous impact on reducing biodiversity loss risk. Thanks.
Wonderful, and thank you very much for staying so brief in your answers, which means that we can actually interact a little bit with the room. So I'm going to pick out a couple of questions. One is around, can you talk about the time windows in which biodiversity risks play out and what the matching investment windows should look like? Who wants to play with that one? Everybody's looking at Karen.
I'll attempt to answer that. Yes, well, it varies depending on what you're talking about, of course. They're all different, but there often is a mismatch in that the returns are probably relatively long-term in quite a few cases. So we've been looking at regenerative agriculture in the UK, and even then, in each subsector is a different story. But for dairy, for example, to switch to a regenerative model could take, 7 to 10 years, which is probably going to disincentivize most private finance, but not all, but most. And not only that, but one of the barriers to it is the uncertainty that it will be adequately rewarded. So for farmers who aren't necessarily very well placed to take on lots of risk, they're often not very high earners anyway, it's quite hard to make that leap of faith, to invest in a whole new business model if it's not clear to them there will be demand from suppliers or support from government in terms of subsidies, etc., that will help to make that an economically sensible decision. And so even when financing is provided by certain financial institutions, the demand for it isn't there because the farmers are too nervous about the impact, whether it will actually be a long-term gain for them. So there are a lot of problems in making those investment decisions work at the moment, which could be fixed by greater investment certainty from both the government in terms of its policy framework, but also customers and like, for example, supermarket retailers who have the potential to reward farmers who invest in those kinds of business models, for example. So at the moment, there's an attempt to work together with the financial sector, supermarkets, and the government to develop sort of holistic models that create strong enough incentives and clarity and, investment certainty for farmers that they will be more willing to make the leap.
And if I add to that, maybe, if we come back to the risk, I think a more realistic risk pricing would help this hugely, because if you look at we did a piece of work on the farm-to-fork policy and looked at how that would influence the value of fertilizer companies. And essentially, depending on how widely you introduce the farm-to-fork, whether it's EU or pretty wider, you see the financial value of fertilizer producers doing by about 50%. Now again, if we had that kind of analysis embedded into it, then suddenly there is a lot more incentive to move. you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, and I'll speak to just a part of this. So there's a real important question here around what you prioritize. Biodiversity is about everything, right? It is everywhere in the world, right? However, it is concentrated in some places in the world and in some biomes, right? As we've chosen to focus on tropical forests in large part because they are the tropical forests in good shape in the world are the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. And we focused on protecting those because that's the highest priority in terms of actually achieving mitigation, right? So if you look at that space, I can tell you that these data are not published yet, but we look at this index around the integrity of these forests, which includes their composition, their structure, their function. We've looked at data from the end of the last, say, about a 4 or 5 year period starting in 2017. Everywhere in tropical forest countries, integrity is declining, but the variability is quite large. It's from very low, like 1 or 2% annually, to areas that have declined up to 20% during that period of time. So it's quite differentiated, right? The cost of what would it cost to protect these areas also really varies from place to place. If you take a value-based approach about like what it's really worth to the global economy, then it's upwards of $30 per hectare per year, right, in terms of the actual value. If you take a cost-based approach, it's anywhere from a couple of dollars a year to $20, $25 a year, depending on where you are in the world. So there are those kinds of issues that there are emerging some reasonable data on, but that hasn't really connected to the kind of question that you're asking yet. Thanks.
Yeah, just one final point. I think it's good that we're talking about risk, and it's kind of exciting that risk gets you talking to the right people, the people with the money, the people with the finance, because it's particularly banks and with a global footprint or companies with a global footprint who understand, are used to looking at risk. It's talking to the right kind of people. But I kind of like to flip it to also looking at opportunity as well. I think you only have to be in here and to get the general sense of society as a whole that we need to move towards a nature-positive society. It's the only future we have, otherwise things are pretty bleak, as the stats from the Green Finance Institute and other stats that are coming out show. So the only realistic future is a nature-positive future. So for companies that are looking at this going, oh, what's the return going to be, or is it going to be short-term, is it going to be longer-term? Yes, sometimes these things are longer-term if we're talking about restoration or things like that, but there's also things you can do in the short term, as Daniel said, in terms of protecting the areas that are of highest biodiversity already that are within supply chains or that are directly affecting businesses. So I think looking at it as an opportunity now for bold and forward-thinking companies and investors, like you will look back in 10, 20 years' time and appreciate the fact that you made those bold decisions now. I think if we talk too much about wanting certainty of risk, like with biodiversity, it's inherently a thing that's very hard to predict, and we're very good at. We have the tools and the indigenous communities to protect it, and we have the innovations to help us measure it better. But really, it's the only way forward, a nature-positive economy. So think of it as an opportunity rather than a risk would be my message.
Though I have to say I'm really excited about finally having numbers in the double digits in terms of GDP impacts, because a lot of the previous studies has been nature goes completely gone and the impact on GDP is 0.5%. So I think from that perspective, 12% is a huge improvement on what we've had. We have another question here around one of the benefits of biodiversity markets that they can cover non-forest ecosystem, and we're talking a lot about forests, how to conserve other ecosystems, the non-forest ones. It's like a race between Dan and Rob.
So yeah, I can probably talk to this a little bit because we work primarily in the UK and we don't have much of forest left. So yeah, there's this debate around where should we channel finance first and where should we prioritize our actions, and it depends. Again, it's all country specific. So yeah, as a global society and talking to companies with the global supply chain, identifying those risks and avoiding those risks is easily the most financially viable solution and where we should start in terms of the mitigation hierarchy. But there are huge opportunities, again, in terms of restoration of habitats, or if we look at a UK context, I mean, we've depleted virtually all of our nature, but that means there's a huge opportunity for restoration here. So working with the farming communities and providing them with stable financial opportunities over the long term so that they can make decisions to rewild or to integrate habitats into the farming system, because they're not looking at long-term horizons like, say, a forestry company or a utilities company. They're very much just looking within the next few years, or they're very adaptable, but they're also quite short-term in their thinking. So that's because they've not been provided with certainty and finance over the long term. But we've seen through biodiversity net gain, which requires a minimum of 30 years of protection of these habitats, that it's finally getting farmers to think on a longer-term horizon, so they can look at habitat restoration and as an opportunity alongside their farming operations. So yeah, I can only really speak to the UK context from my experience, but there are huge opportunities in various ecosystems that have a huge benefit for the whole of society, whether it's, it could be peatlands where there's carbon benefits as well. It could be, agricultural landscapes where there's benefits for pollinators and for food production as well. So loads of opportunities out there.
Daniel?
I would just say that the same set of instruments that I covered nationally, subnationally, globally, they apply to a full set of biomes, both other terrestrial biomes as well as marine and freshwater biomes. The details will have some variation to them, but that's where there's lots of expertise. Obviously, you can't have everyone on one panel. But for instance, my organization does a lot of work on coral reef ecosystems, applying the same suite of ecosystems. Rob mentioned peatlands. There's also a growing emphasis on grassland and savanna ecosystems in this area. So it's there, it's incipient. I think forests came to the fore earliest for a couple of reasons. One is the carbon and climate related issues. And the second is for some of the metrics, the fact that, forests have three-dimensional qualities that are more easily measured from remote sensing platforms has facilitated some of that work. But the same set of instruments applies. But we do need work at the biome level to address the opportunities.
Karen?
Thank you. So I just thought I'd add a little bit on freshwater because that's another key nature-related risk that is growing very fast, both in terms of biodiversity impacts, but also in terms of water quality, health impacts, and droughts in many parts of the world as well. So WWF does a lot of work in this space, not so much in the UK, but elsewhere. And there's a real need for sort of landscape-based approaches and/or jurisdictional approaches, whereby you work together with all the stakeholders in that area or in that basin to understand what the conflicting demands and activities, the impact of all of those, and the plans for the future, how that will affect the water availability, because what you have is obviously a very connected system where the actions of one set of firms might well undermine the future growth of the agriculture sector downstream. That's just an example. There's many ways that may play out. So you need all the different stakeholders in the room to be negotiating solutions. And there is a real need for sort of land use planning, similarly, to sort of help navigate some of those conflicting demands for resources. And that's going to be a really growing problem in many parts of the world in coming years as a result of climate change. So I think we are going to need a lot more collaboration between stakeholders with the involvement of government and the private sector. But much easier if government can have a bit of a vision and, coordinate that process rather than requiring or expecting private sector to try and generate that from scratch by itself, because the transactions costs of that, as you can imagine, are quite significant, especially when it's not clear if a particular company or player has a responsibility or a mandate to drive that solution. So you really having government mandate, at least, and government involvement ideally, would really help to make that happen more effectively and be implemented more reliably, I suppose, as well. So I think that's probably the direction we need to head in, and there is some progress in that direction, but it still remains very challenging, obviously, in many parts of the world.
And then there's a question here, kind of bringing it slightly closer to the action. So how do we, any advice on persuading investors that they need to move into a blue-green asset base despite the returns and the timelines and all of those wonderful things? Yep.
I'll start because this is a topic that I've been working on myself for some of our own work, so a little bit familiar with it. I think the challenge that we're in right now is a bit of a first mover problem. It's not that there haven't been any movements in any of these agendas by some, but it's still quite early in terms of the maturity of the understanding in the investor sector about the issues that we're discussing here. And I think part of the learning curve for all of us is to narrow that question a bit on why would this be of interest to a particular investor of a particular kind? What would their interest be in addressing these material risks, which may not necessarily be, say, a corporate that is focused on producing a particular widget and that has to do with, directly costing an impact on their value chain. You might have some of that, but the broader question is wider about investors that are concerned about material risks that are cross-cutting within an economy, right? And those are going to tend to be, I think, this is my hypothesis, I think those are going to tend to be larger players in the finance sector who are themselves exposed to material risks that cut across the global economy and who have a challenge that their traditional methods of risk reduction, for example, having very diverse portfolios, right? If you're say you're the Norwegian wealth fund, right, and you own 1 or 2% of global assets, you're doing a lot of that, right? But the risks associated with biodiversity loss, climate change, cut across your whole portfolio. So you might then be interested in actually how do you invest in material risk reduction through natural assets, through conservation, through the natural infrastructure that regulates climate, that limits biodiversity loss. Those are, I think, an early set of the kinds of investors that might be interested because some of them are starting to recognize those risks. They're not small players and they're not narrow to a particular industry. They're broadly exposed to risks in the global economy. Thanks.
So the concept of universal asset ownerships and the need to steer the entire piece. Rob?
I was just going to add one quick point and case study, I guess, which is us ourselves at Environment Bank, and we were looking for investment for a long time to scale things up, and what we needed to get that confidence for investors to come in was the idea of legislation coming in and a potential market coming forward, and we actually managed to secure the investment before the policy came in from Gresham House and the British Sustainable Investment Fund, Infrastructure Fund, sorry. But the policy, the fact that they knew that there was a legislative requirement coming forward meant that they had the confidence to invest there. So I guess coming back to that point of policy and legislation providing an important lever here, even if it's just the acknowledgement that things like the TNFD will become mandated in the coming years, I think those kind of things are going to show investors that that is the direction of travel, and we can't stay in this kind of voluntary space. And even though I am optimistic that this idea of risk and opportunity will drive investment, I think using those levers of legislation and policy to just kickstart investment into nature restoration, I think is key as well. So.
But there's also a much more basic point, right? That there is no investment on a dead planet. So the entire financial system is embedded into nature, into environment, into ecosystem services. So I think sometimes we talk about these things as if we have a choice whether to transition or not to transition. That's not the choice we're facing. We're facing the choice of, are we going to have a good transition or are we going to have a really problematic, disruptive transition? And so from that perspective, the earlier you invest, the more you're tilting towards a somewhat reasonable transition, even with all the stuff that we've already got baked in. Karen, did you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I think to encourage investors onto a blue-green asset base, there's a lot that can be done not only on the risk side but on the valuing nature side to actually make it an investable proposition by government. There's lots of different solutions. It could be the use of taxes or regulation or just coordination around insurance solutions, for example, that there's lots of opportunity to invest in nature in a way which will reduce risks and make savings for insurers, but there's very limited incentives for them to do it by themselves because of all the free rider effects and other insurers, they're all competing. So, and local communities, etc. So there's a lot of potential for collaboration to develop joint solutions that then make it an investable proposition. There's a lot of activity in that space. Probably you're working on that, so you know a lot more about it than I do. But that's just one example, I think, of how government policy can help to put a value on nature, which then makes it an investable proposition because you will actually make money from investing in it, which at the moment is very hard to do in most cases. So I think there's a scope to do that a lot more. And although there may be concerns about putting a price on something that was previously free and maybe even like moral qualms about it, I think that at the moment it is being priced by the economy, but at zero. So it's like having a terrible detrimental impact on the way that those assets are used. So we need to find ways to solve that. And yeah, we need a lot more creative thinking, I think, on that front.
And if I'm just reflecting on that, a lot more collaboration. We did a piece of work at the end of last year, which we titled Everything Everywhere All at Once. And we talked about how to drive private finance into the climate-nature nexus. So I think it is on all of us, it is on all of you to help drive this problem forward. So, but everything that remains for me to say a huge thank you to the wonderful panel, and thank you to all of you for giving us lots of questions to answer.